Before we go any further, let's briefly recap where we are in the series. In the first two pieces, we looked at ignition points. Certain themes like sex, power, violence, and especially children activate very primitive emotional circuitry in the brain. Research in neuroscience and behavioral psychology shows that emotionally charged stimuli can trigger rapid emotional responses before slower analytical reasoning engages. And when those circuits activate, we often rely on heuristics, those mental shortcuts we discussed earlier in the series, and we rely on them instead of careful analysis. And it doesn't make people irrational, it just makes them human. But here's the thing. Once that outrage ignites, something else begins to happen. The reaction doesn't stay constant, it compounds. And the compounding doesn't happen only inside individuals, it also happens across groups. But before we can start unpacking this, there's an important point to keep in mind. Even though social forces are involved, all belief formation still happens inside the individual mind. Crowds don't think. Individuals do, but an individual's thinking is affected inside a crowd. And if you don't believe me, try reasoning with a mob sometime. In the first two episodes, we examined internal mechanisms, biases, and heuristics operating inside the brain. Today, we're looking at external forces acting on those same minds. And those are repetition, rumor, storytelling, media framing, social pressure. All those forces operate outside the individual. But every headline, every comment and conversation eventually lands in the same place. One individual brain trying to decide what is true. Once outrage ignites, emotional reactions begin to accumulate. And I'd like you to think of outrage like compounding interest in an emotional bank account. The first reaction deposits something in the account, and then every new headline, tweet, conversation, or trigger adds another deposit, compounding the interest all the way along. Psychologists describe something related called the affect heuristic. And that's where people rely on emotional reactions as a shortcut for judgment. When something feels morally outrageous, dangerous, or even just emotionally threatening, the feeling itself begins to function as evidence. Emotion doesn't just react to information, it begins to shape how new information is interpreted. And once that emotional lens is in place, several other mechanisms begin to interact. The first is repetition. It's called the illusory truth effect. And experiments beginning back in the late 70s demonstrated that repeated statements are more likely to be judged as true simply because they become familiar, even if the statements are false. The mechanism is simple. Familiarity begins to feel like credibility. If you hear something once, you evaluate it. If you hear something 50 times, it begins to feel like common knowledge. This is even and especially true with friends and family. Repeated complaints and observations begin to take on the shape of truths if repeated often enough. You hear he or she is kind of difficult, repeated in conversation among your social group. Now, every interaction gets filtered through that lens. Neutral comments seem like attitude. Disagreements look like problems, and boundaries become personality flaws. The repetition becomes the evidence. Validation mutates into support of the closing of the loop and amplifying of the effect. Now you're no longer evaluating, you're nodding and confirming an unsubstantiated comment. What started as a vented utterance is now concreted into a character flaw. But repetition introduces another problem, because language itself is a blunt instrument, and information tends to change as it spreads. Think back to a classroom game many of us played as kids called telephone. The teacher would whisper a phrase to the first student, and then that student would whisper it to the next, and so on and so on. And by the time the message reaches the last kid in the last row, it's usually a completely different sentence. Sometimes an incoherent jumble of words, but often a coherent sentence with a very different meaning. Psychologists studying rumor transmission noticed the same phenomena in real life. As stories pass from one person to another, details tend to be simplified, or exaggerated, or reshaped to fit expectations. Details get dropped for narrative simplicity, and numbers get rounded up or down, and ambiguities get filled in for impact. A fender bender that blocked the street for a half hour slowly morphs into a 10-car pileup, not because people are lying, but because stories evolve as they travel. There's another subtle distortion, and that happens when stories spread. Similar to distortion through transmission, where facts or details get obscured when recorded by the listener, a similar and compounding distortion occurs in the retelling, where the error lies in the retransmission and the recollection. Storytellers often amplify details in order to make the story land with the listener, and not necessarily intentionally, but because humans naturally try to make stories clearer, funnier, or more dramatic, the end result is a transformation, a mutation. So 5 soldiers on patrol becomes a battalion, and a guy with a cut on his face had his jaw hanging off, and your brother sees your girlfriend chatting with a stranger on the street, and now she's flirting. Uncertainty disappears, numbers grow, and the story sharpens. And when studying memory, this is called reconstructive memory, the idea that people don't replay memories like recordings, but reconstruct them each time they tell the story. In that retelling, there's shifts and variations. And during that reconstructive process, stories often become simpler, clearer, and more dramatic. And not coincidentally, most often reinforcing the storyteller's point of view or subjective bias. Now imagine what happens when those evolving stories begin circulating wildly. This is where social amplification begins, when repeated claims spread through public discussion. It's described as the process of an availability cascade. A claim appears and commenters repeat it. News outlets discuss the reaction. Social media amplifies the conversation, and soon the claim feels obvious. Not necessarily because it's been proven, but because it's become impossible to avoid. We've seen this play out in real life. Take Richard Jewell. He was a security guard at the Atlanta Olympics in 1996. He finds a suspicious backpack and rushes to help people evacuate. Calling attention, he saves lives. At first, he's a hero, and then his name starts showing up everywhere as a suspect, person of interest. Story after story, shadier and shadier. And soon, that becomes the story. Not because it was proven, but because it was repeated. CNN, NBC speculated wildly and irresponsibly, but the story felt coherent. He fit the narrative, except it wasn't true. He was completely innocent. The actual bomber was Eric Rudolph, and he was identified only years later. By the time it came out, Jewell's life had already been torn apart, ruined. At that point, another process begins, and that's when facts start getting arranged into narratives. Media outlets do this constantly, but friends and family are no less likely culprits. Human beings understand information through stories. So a headline appears and it's dramatic, but generally without the entire context. And then another headline seems connected, and then commentary interpreting those headlines. And then piece by piece, a narrative begins to form. Even if the individual fact is accurate, the sequence and the framing can guide audiences towards a particular interpretation. Layer by layer, the story becomes more complete. You might think of this as a term narrative stacking. Once a narrative takes hold, something else starts to happen, and that's suggestion, sort of infused into the way in which the narrative is stacked. So let's look again at Richard Jewell. What's interesting is it isn't just that he was falsely suspected, it's how the story was built. There wasn't one piece of evidence that proved anything, and instead there was a series of facts. He found a bomb. He wanted to be in law enforcement. He'd been described as overly eager in prior roles. Then the theory gets introduced, the idea of the hero bomber, someone who creates a crisis so they can swoop in and save the day. Now those pieces begin to get stacked, and they stack them in a particular order, and suddenly you have a story. A guy who wants attention, inserts himself into danger, and then becomes the hero. It fits, it feels right, it's coherent, but it just wasn't true. Now, confirmation bias. If I tell you that someone has a tremor, what do? You start looking for it. And once you're looking for it, you see it everywhere. A slight shake of the hand, a small erratic movement, maybe a cup gets knocked off the counter accidentally, and now it confirms what you've already been told. Or let's say I tell you, start noticing red cars. Suddenly they're everywhere. And that's not because there are more red cars, but because your attention has been directed. The same thing happens with narratives. Once a story gets in your head, you start filtering the world through that perspective. You notice the details that fit, and you ignore the ones that don't. So you remember seeing 10 red cars, but have no recollection of seeing any blue ones. And every new observation starts to feel like a confirmation, not because the evidence is stronger, but because your perception has been guided to be sensitive to the data that reinforces that viewpoint. This is confirmation bias. This leads to one of the most important distinctions in all of reasoning and logic, and that is coherency versus cogency. A story can be coherent without being cogent. Coherent means the pieces appear to fit together logically. Cogent means the conclusion is supported by strong evidence. Logic 101, all cats have four paws, all dogs have four paws, therefore all cats are dogs. Sounds orderly. The statements appear to connect, but the conclusion is illustratively absurd. The argument is coherent, but it isn't cogent. And we've seen this pattern before as well. Take the Duke lacrosse case. Privileged athletes at a party, there's accusations of inappropriateness. Again, it all fit right up until the evidence collapsed. And it isn't just in the news, it's right in your own backyard. Your neighbor likes to hunt and you hate guns. He's digging in his backyard. Your dog is missing. Your dog always barks at him. He must have killed your dog and buried it in his backyard. Until 2 days later when she shows up at the back door covered in mud and pregnant, and he's out in the backyard planting vegetables. Coherent? Definitely. Cogent? Not so much. So let's face it, there's a little bit of a Karen buried inside all of us. Humans are extremely sensitive to narrative structure. Coherent story can feel persuasive even when the underlying reasoning hasn't actually been proven. Now, sometimes a statement or position is neither coherent nor cogent, and this is another type of failure. People string together terms, phrases, ideas that sound important, but when you slow it down, there's no clear chain of reasoning. It doesn't make any sense at all, but it's often delivered with authority. That's incoherence, word salad, something I've been accused of more than once in the comments. In medicine, incoherent speech is when the words are real, but the meaning doesn't hold together. Now, here's where it gets interesting. In everyday life, people often, they don't stop and say, wait, that didn't make sense. They'll assume I must have missed something, or that sounded smart, but I just didn't follow. And instead of challenging it, they let it pass. Or worse, they accept the conclusion anyway. Now you have something that's even more dangerous. An argument that is neither coherent nor cogent, still leading to a strong conclusion. And if you layer in what sounds like confidence, emotion, or social pressure, people may go along just to avoid the friction. And you see a lot of this in heated conversations or obviously in politics. Long chains of language that sounds like reasoning, but doesn't actually connect. And by the time you get to the end, there's a conclusion sitting there and nothing solid underneath it. You know, if you can't explain how you got there, you probably didn't get there. Because if you can't explain it to a third grader, then you don't even understand it yourself in the first place. And sometimes it's not about amplifying a belief. It's about suppressing a competing one. This dynamic is known as the spiral of silence. People constantly monitor the climate of an opinion around them. If they believe their view is unpopular or socially costly, they'll often stay quiet. And this silence gives the illusion that a dominant view is even stronger, more widely accepted, and resistant to change. This completes a loop, causing even more people to remain silent. In economic theory, there's a related phenomenon, and it's called preference falsification. And this is where individuals publicly express views very different from their private beliefs because of social pressure, less kindly referred to as performative lying. So imagine someone who volunteers for PETA, invited for the weekend in Aspen where everyone's wearing fur, or a coworker bragging about an extramarital affair. You stay quiet, you're not alone, not because you agree, but because speaking up has a cost. And every person who stays quiet strengthens the illusion that everyone agrees. There have even been real-world examples of entire communities or secret societies forming around this dynamic. Friends of Abe is a private networking group for politically conservative professionals in the entertainment industry, because expressing political views publicly could carry social or professional consequences. Sometimes people hide their beliefs when they think the environment is hostile to them, and when dissent becomes quiet, consensus can appear much stronger than it actually is. Now let's step back and look at the full chain of external pressures. Emotion ignites. Stories mutate into rumor and gossip as they travel. Storytellers amplify the details. Repetition reinforces familiarity. Social networks amplify visibility. Narratives take shape. Perception gets filtered. Dissent goes quiet. And by the time the public conversation stabilizes, a narrative may feel completely certain, even if the underlying evidence has barely been examined. Which raises the next question. How do we actually evaluate claims like this? How do we separate compelling narratives or juicy gossip from strong evidence? And that's where methodology comes in. In the next piece, we'll look at tools like Bayesian reasoning, Occam's razor, and evidentiary standards. Because if we want to move beyond outrage, narrative, and gossip, we need methods that help us distinguish between what feels convincing and what is actually supported by the evidence. And that's food for thought.